Thank you so much, Borja, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to say a few words today at this incredibly complex moment. I think everyone who serves in positions of responsibility in foreign policy and national security likes to say that their time in the seat is the most complex and difficult of any time in recent history, but in our case, it's actually true. So we'll just chalk that one up. You know, the first 2 decades of this forum after its founding in 1971 were shaped by the Cold War. Then, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, for about a quarter century, the world's major powers seemed to be converging around a single concept of international order. We integrated former competitors into our international economic institutions, and we bet that this would speed and cement that convergence. Today, we're in the early years of a new era. Major powers are vastly more interdependent than at any time during the Cold War. But we're also in stiff competition about the type of world we want to build. This age is one of disruptive change. Some of this has been positive, as countries find new ways of harnessing technology, promoting development, and deepening ties with one another. But some of this has been negative, as dangerous actors test the limits of our ever-evolving international system. I've even heard the occasional comparison to the 1930s, but I proceed from the deep conviction that we are never doomed to repeat the past, and the passage from one era to another comes with the obligation and the opportunity to choose more wisely. And so, in the face of naked aggression, we are not turning inward. Under President Biden's leadership, we're rallying a global response to push back. We're pursuing intensive and proactive diplomacy to manage our most consequential relationships. We're investing in the sources of our own national strength and those of our allies and partners. We're not turning away from the international economic system, but adapting it to the challenges of today and tomorrow. And we're competing vigorously to shape the future of the international system. That's the broad backdrop, and I want to talk with you briefly about these efforts and why I remain optimistic about the future and our ability to meet the main challenge of our time: strategic competition in an age of interdependence. Let me take you back 2 years ago to this day, when Putin had amassed 180,000 soldiers on Ukraine's border, surrounding the country on 3 sides. He expected a quick victory, that he could send a column of tanks to Kyiv and topple the democratically elected government of Ukraine, that he could weaken NATO and restore Russia's sphere of influence. But he underestimated the people of Ukraine. For 2 years, with support from a coalition of more than 50 partners led by the United States, the people of Ukraine have remained unflinching against an adversary with an economy 10 times larger, a population 3 times bigger, and a military once ranked as the second best in the world. 2 years later, Putin has not only failed in his imperialist quest to subjugate Ukraine, his invasion has strengthened Ukrainian sovereignty, the very sovereignty he sought to erase, and bolstered the very NATO resolve he sought to weaken. In fact, while he sought to diminish NATO, his action grew our ranks instead. Brave Ukrainian soldiers have retaken more than half of the territory that Russia occupied from the start of this conflict. They've repulsed Russia's attempts at an offensive last winter, and they're repulsing one this winter. They've severely degraded Russia's Black Sea fleet, dramatically increasing Ukraine's exports through the Black Sea. They've imposed severe costs on the Russian military, destroying major capabilities built up over decades. And amid all of this, Ukraine has made economic reforms, strengthened its own defense industrial base, and accelerated its integration with the West. Of course, the fight is not over. Russia has laid dense minefields across the front lines, making it harder for Ukraine to make major territorial gains. With China's help, Putin is mobilizing Russia's defense industrial base, putting the country's economy on a wartime footing. And Russia is seeking more weapons from both North Korea and Iran, which violates multiple UN Security Council resolutions that Moscow itself voted to put in place. But as President Zelensky has discussed with President Biden, and as Secretary Blinken and I discussed with him earlier today, the people of Ukraine are steeled for the struggle ahead, and the United States and our partners will continue to stand with them. We're expanding training for Ukrainian troops. We're working to secure bipartisan support for the necessary resources to supply Ukraine with the weapons it needs. We're ramping up our own defense industrial base while denying Russia access to critical inputs it needs to do the same. And we're also innovating, and this is a critical point, working with our partners and especially with the private sector to help Ukraine solve the key technological challenges of an evolving battlefield, like electronic warfare, drones, and demining. Together, we will build on our sanctions to ensure that even as unsustainable war spending masks underlying weakness, the economic costs for Russia continue to mount. And we will keep supporting Ukraine's diplomatic efforts to secure a just and lasting peace that protects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the principles of the UN Charter. Because we've seen time and time again what happens when aggressors are allowed to take a neighbor's territory by force and don't pay a price. They keep going. We've also worked to rally an international response to new aggression in the Middle East. In the Red Sea, reckless attacks by the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, including the use of anti-ship ballistic missiles, have threatened freedom of navigation in one of the world's most vital waterways. More than 50 nations have been affected in nearly 30 attacks. Last week, the United States and the United Kingdom, with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands, struck a number of targets in Yemen used by the Houthis to stage and launch these attacks. This defensive action followed extensive multinational coordination led by the United States among 44 nations to condemn Houthi attacks, and also led to a UN Security Council resolution condemning those attacks. We are not looking for regional conflict, far from it. Through a combination of steady deterrence and steadfast diplomacy, we seek to stop the spread of conflict and to create the conditions for de-escalation. Our approach is and remains focused on moving towards greater integration and stability in the region. Long before October 7th, the United States was deeply engaged in an effort to secure a political horizon for the Palestinian people, with Israel's security guaranteed as part of that. We judged that direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, which had fallen short so many times before, was unlikely to succeed. We determined the best approach was to work towards a package deal that involved normalization between Israel and key Arab states, together with meaningful progress and a political horizon for the Palestinian people. That was our goal before October 7th. And it was our progress toward that goal that Hamas sought to destroy on October 7th, when they came across the border into Israel, viciously massacred 1,200 people, took more than 200 hostages, and then turned and fled, hiding behind an innocent civilian population and vowing to commit October 7th again and again. That is the reality Israel is contending with, a determined terrorist threat that chose as its battlefield the communities of innocent civilians, and still to this day holds more than 100 hostages in circumstances that are dire and deteriorating. Now, this does not lessen at all Israel's responsibility to conduct its campaign in a way that upholds international humanitarian law and abides by the moral and strategic necessity to distinguish between terrorists and innocent civilians. Every innocent life, Palestinian, Israeli, everyone, is sacred and deserves to be protected. And the United States will continue to work with the rest of the world to secure the release of the hostages and to ensure the Palestinian people have access to the food, water, medicine, and safety that they urgently need and deserve as human beings. As we respond to this crisis, we are actively pursuing a pathway to normalization and integration with our regional partners. There's a lot to do, but we are working together day in and day out to think about what a future can and should look like after the conflict. A future where Gaza is never again used as a platform for terror. A future where Israelis and Arabs can live in peace, Palestinians have a state of their own, and Israel's security is assured. I know that in this moment where there's so much anger and pain and so much uncertainty, it's hard to imagine. But it really is the only path that provides peace and security for all, And what is more, it is not impractical. It can be done. The pieces are there to be put together to achieve this outcome, and not years down the road, but in the nearer term, if all of us pull together and make the wise and bold decisions to choose this course. Now, as we're dealing with unfolding crises in Ukraine and the Middle East, we're also managing critical relationships around the world, none more critical than the relationship between the United States and China. The United States is competing with China across multiple dimensions, and we make no bones about that. But we are not looking for confrontation or conflict, and we are seeking to manage that competition responsibly, intensifying diplomacy to reduce the risk of miscalculation. We saw this just last November when President Biden and President Xi met in Woodside, California. They agreed to restart counter-narcotics cooperation, and since then, Beijing has actually taken affirmative steps to halt the flow of precursor chemicals used to make fentanyl, progress that we hope and need to see continue. We also agreed to resume military-to-military communications and have already taken steps to do so. The chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff just spoke with his counterpart for the first time in his job and the first time in quite a long time, and this is to the good for our relationship, but also for regional and global stability. It will help reduce the risk of unintended conflict. And together, the US and China will launch a new dialogue aimed at minimizing and managing the risks of artificial intelligence. Now, we are doing all this while at the same time making the investments in ourselves and our partners so that we can continue to compete effectively. We've revitalized our own industrial and innovation base with historic legislation while seeking to address Beijing's unfair economic practices. We've energized our alliances and partnerships in the Indo-Pacific and Europe in ways that were, frankly, unimaginable a few years ago. The launch of AUKUS, elevating the Quad, new agreements with Vietnam, the Philippines, and India, a historic trilateral with Japan and South Korea, and 2 summits with Pacific Island states. We've come together with our G7 partners and agreed on collective steps to de-risk our economies and diversify away from strategic dependencies rather than decoupling. And together with allies and partners, we've stressed the importance of maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. All the while, we've been transparent and straightforward about the targeted and narrowly tailored steps we've taken to protect critical technologies. And I want to spend a minute on this, because technology competition is global. In an interdependent world, there's a risk that it could contribute to a broader trend of disintegration. That's why we are working to bring together countries and companies to set high standards for emerging technologies and secure the trusted free flow of data. We've also taken steps in partnership with others to protect foundational technologies with what we've called a small yard and a high fence. Today, military advantage hinges on access to critical technologies, some of which are commercial and dual use, like advanced semiconductors. Simply put, our strategic competitors should not be able to exploit American technologies to undermine our national security or that of our allies and partners. To deal with this, we've taken steps to regulate specific outbound investments of concern in technology, and we've implemented carefully tailored restrictions on exports, focused on advanced semiconductor manufacturing tools, supercomputing capabilities, and the most advanced chips, which are critical to a range of military platforms, including weapons of mass destruction, hypersonic missiles, and autonomous weapon systems. Key allies and partners have followed suit, acting on their own concerns. Now, I want to be clear. These tailored measures are not a technology blockade. They do not seek to, nor in fact do they, restrict broader trade and investment. And in fact, in our semiconductor rule that we put out just a few months ago, last October, there is a broad carve-out for commercial chips, the kind of chips that can help power economic progress and growth. Our goal is to ensure that the next generation of technologies works for, not against, our security and our democracy. Now, last spring at the Brookings Institution, I talked about the work that President Biden was doing to respond to the economic challenges that he faced when he took office. that in recent decades, America had enjoyed solid top-line GDP growth, but the benefits of that growth were not being broadly shared across America's middle class. That our economic policy was not taking sufficient account of a massive non-market economy like China. That our approach was not delivering fast enough or ambitiously enough on a clean energy transition, and that these problems were not unique to the United States. President Biden entered office with a simple and powerful affirmative answer. It was not an answer to abandon what had built America into the strongest, most innovative economy in the world, but rather to rediscover it. It starts with investing, with returning to an American tradition that runs through Lincoln's Continental Railroad, Eisenhower's highways, and Kennedy's moonshot. And because of that choice, today the United States has the strongest recovery and lowest inflation of any leading economy. We've created nearly 14 million jobs, including 750,000 manufacturing jobs across all 50 states. Real wages are rising. We've had 23 straight months of unemployment under 4% for the first time in half a century. And what's even more compelling in a forum like this, our partners have joined us in this journey. This time last year, there were murmurs that the United States' historic domestic investments would fracture the global economic order and weaken our alliances. The reality is that countries around the world want to follow the formula that we've developed, and we want to help them do that. Making bold investments, building high-quality infrastructure, empowering workers, tackling climate change. And we've also been focused on ensuring our approach works for everyone, including emerging market and developing countries. With our partners, we're mobilizing greater private investment to address development needs, to get from the billions being invested today to the trillions that are needed. That's the main goal of the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, or PGI, that we launched with our G7 partners last year. Its signature approach of spurring growth along economic corridors. We're also leading the way on reforming multilateral development banks to provide a viable option for countries to invest in their futures, including middle-income countries who haven't had access to the low-cost financing they need and deserve. We're building innovative new international economic partnerships, including the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity. Because our fundamental view is that international economic policy needs to be about solving the problems of today, not the problems of 50 years ago. Building resilience in our supply chains, mobilizing investment, massive investment for an effective clean energy transition, ensuring trust and transparency in digital innovation, stopping a race to the bottom in corporate taxation, tackling corruption, and advancing a trade policy that puts the rights and well-being of workers and working families at its core. Now, as the National Security Advisor of the United States, my job is to worry. Worry about the things I've talked about today, and there's plenty to say grace over there, but also worry about other threats too, like North Korea. But let me close with a couple of thoughts on why I remain optimistic. First, the more others seek to undermine the international system through violence and coercion, the more it brings our allies and partners closer together. This is the paradox that leaders like Putin cannot seem to solve. Second, when it comes to world politics, people around this planet are much more interested in whether or not their lives are improving than in anyone's imperial ambition or imperial project. So as long as we continue to be focused on offering a global value proposition that delivers for people, that is serious about shared economic growth, tackling climate change, managing new technologies, and promoting good governance, our model will remain much more attractive globally than that of aggression or coercion or intimidation or confrontation. So we're going to stay the course and look to our partners, including all of you, to continue with us, to make clear that violent disruption of the international system will fail, to remain committed to diplomacy, which is even more vital as geopolitical tensions rise, and to take steps needed to lead in the sources of technological and economic growth that will be the foundation of success and strength in free societies. Nothing in world politics is inevitable. We are in command of our own choices. So it's up to us to summon the vision, commitment, and sense of shared purpose to make the right choices, to shape the future for the benefit of our fellow citizens and future generations to come. So thank you for giving me the opportunity today.